The 615th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
Alton ready on his second attempt. That one is no good. They battle for it. Loose ball. Recovered. Marvin. He scores. 17-second left. And he was fouled. Here we go. Lawson with a runner. No. The rebound. Hansbrough at the gun. Got it.
They were 4 for 24.
Hansbrough on a switch on Paulus. A deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Tipped away by Johnson. It's loose. Page. Johnson.
They're dancing in the aisles. They're high-fiving. They're celebrating. They're going bananas on Franklin Street.
Pass to Britt, 15 seconds to play. Up high to Page, gets a screen from Meeks. Page driving in on the left, high off the glass for two. Louisville with 7 seconds. Jones has it, goes left corner, Black's here for three. Back iron, 1 second to play. Stick up, no! Carolina wins it! The Tar Heels win it! 72-71. 6 seconds to go. Pinson comes front court. Pinson to May for the win. Got it! Luke May! He got it! 0.3 of a second! Luke May gives Carolina the 75-73 lead. Are you kidding me?
Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome into another edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. And as you can see, it's not Josh and Anthony with you guys today. It is Josh and Ashtin. Ashtin is back for another installment of Ashtin's analysis. The Heels have played 5 games. They have a week off. And so we got little bro on the pod to talk about the beginning of the season. Before we get to that, though, we'll start every edition of the pod as we always do, with the pod thought of the day, which I was not even able to pick out because Ashtin took the liberty to do that on his own. We go to Michael Jordan for that pod thought. That thought is, quote, obstacles don't have to stop you. If you run into a wall, don't turn around and give up. Figure out how to climb it, go through it, or work around it, end quote. Carolina's faced an early obstacle, losing senior guard Seth Trimble. He's out for about the next month or so. He said he's a fast healer and he'll be back before the expected timeline. But regardless, that was an early obstacle for Carolina to overcome. Losing the vocal leader of your team on the court, your best backcourt perimeter player in terms of what he can do offensively, as well as being the best perimeter defender in the conference. And so Carolina right now is having to figure out how to work around that. They're either trying to climb it, go through it, or work around it. But that's probably the biggest early obstacle the team has faced because Carolina is sitting here. They're 5-0 and got some things to work on and improve. They've done some good things early on very well in the beginning of the season.
Yeah, and I definitely picked out this quote with the thought process of talking about what we missed with Seth Trimble, especially you mentioned the perimeter defense. But you know, Carolina's they've gotten their couple of I listened to Locked On Tar Heels, Isaac Shea calling them bye games. They've gotten their bye games. Now it's time. Now moving forward, it's time to go to work against higher quality opponents. And unfortunately, we have to do so without Seth Trimble for about the next month or so. So, that was kind of my motivation in picking this pod thought. We gotta work around these obstacles, and we'll see how Carolina does that moving forward.
Well, a little bit of programming note for those of you that maybe listen to us and listen to Isaac. Yours truly will be on the Friday edition of the show, so be on the lookout for that. Isaac's a good friend. And I always love talking Carolina basketball and Tar Heel football with him. Let's go ahead and jump right into Ashton's analysis. As I mentioned, Carolina 5-0 on the year. They've earned wins so far over Central Arkansas, the big win at home over Kansas, and then the bye games that you mentioned, Radford, North Carolina, Central, and then, of course, most recently here against Navy. The Heels find themselves 29th in KenPom, 36th in offensive rating, 23rd in defensive rating. When you look at Carolina's most recent game, and that, of course, was the win over Navy, which was the most uneven performance of the season, how would you categorize the first 5 games or so for Carolina, where they reached a real emotional high in that second half against Kansas, maybe the best 20 minutes of basketball they've played under Hubert Davis, outside of maybe the road win at Duke his first year, or maybe some of what they've done in NCAA tournament action, but it's definitely up there in terms of the best basketball they've played under him. You have that as your high, and then a bunch of just uneven first halves that were really separated by big second halves with what Carolina did against NC Central and some others. So how would you categorize the first 2.5 weeks of the season so far for Carolina?
I think it's a success, mainly just because of the win over Kansas. We knew coming into the season that this was a team that was possibly going to take some time to learn how to play together. And that's kind of where I feel like, they're not always on the same page, especially in these first halves. You see a lot of, kind of some careless play. Get a lot of turnovers. I especially think it was the Radford game where they had 10 turnovers in the first half. And then cleaned it up big time in the second half. Maybe that was the NC Central game. I'm probably mixing games up, but either way, you see kind of this uneven, some inconsistent play, and the guys. And I mean, you hear them talk about it. You hear Hubert Davis talk about it. You hear the players talk about it. They're not happy with it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think just because of the Kansas game, that was the big game here for the opening stretch, and you won it. You not only won it, you won it convincingly. I don't put a lot of stock in Carolina's KenPom, although I thought it would be worth mentioning. I checked the KenPom rankings. Clemson has a higher KenPom rating than Carolina, and they have a loss. So, take that with what you may. I'm not too worried about the KenPom. In terms of, the season itself, We've seen some good things. We've seen some bad things. We beat Kansas. That's obviously the good thing. And then we had the Navy game where Carolina just kind of sleptwalked through that entire game. But overall, I think the season so far has been a success. I really like what Caleb Wilson's doing. I really like what we're seeing out of guys like Veesaar and Jaron Stevenson. So, not going to say I expected us to beat Kansas, but we were at home. I wanted us to win that game, obviously, and I feel like we kind of needed, or not necessarily needed, but we should have won that game. So, but overall, I really like where this team's at, and I do think the early part of the season has been a success, despite the struggles in the other day's game against Navy.
Yeah, look, did Carolina need to win the game against Kansas? Obviously not. It's the second game of the year. Hubert Davis needed to win that game just to quiet the critics, the naysayers, and the doubters. But they'll creep back up again if Carolina loses to Michigan State next week, if they fall at Kentucky. That's just the reality of the situation with the coach that enters the season on the proverbial hot seat, according to the mindset of the fan base. What Carolina's done in the first 2.5 weeks is they've shown their potential. And when you see them playing at a high level, it's a team that I think will factor into this ACC regular season race and can play very deep into the NCAA tournament. But you got to remember, when it doesn't look as pretty as you want it to look, they're without a starter, and they're incorporating 11 new players into a roster. And even though the NCAA has relaxed and you get court time in June, July, and you start practice now 3 weeks earlier than you used to, it still doesn't replicate what you do when you get into the games. And this is a group that's learning how to play together. This is a group that's learning how to win together. The other night, they were learning how to close out a game together after they built a really big lead. And I think it's encouraging to see all that stuff kind of culminate. And you can see glimpses of what this team can be. That wasn't the case last year. You never really saw Carolina flash a potential. You just saw a team that was going to struggle. When Carolina was really good 2 years ago, you saw them look this way early on in the year, where you could see what that season became coming together. And that group, won an ACC regular season title and was a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. You set the foundation in November and December. And that's what Carolina, I think, is doing right now. They're setting the foundation for what they can be and hopefully what they will be once the calendar turns to January and you start playing ACC competition. I mentioned the newcomers, 11 new guys on the roster. And so that's the first anecdote you put down here on the on the document. So let's go ahead and get right into it. This is a conversation that Anthony and I have had very early on here in the year, but I'm interested to get your perspective. Who do you think has been the most impactful transfer for Carolina? I think it's an easy answer, but maybe not the one fans expected to hear, considering how much I talked up Kyan Evans over the summer.
Yeah, and I know the easy answer is Henri Veesaar, but first of all, I have to clear up something. Through 5 games of the season, I realized how bad of a take I had with the Jonathan Powell. He's been a good player, don't get me wrong, but he is not going to be the most impactful transfer. But the easy answer is Henri Veesaar. And you can look at what guys like Kyan Evans have done and Jaron Stevenson have done and say, yeah, they could factor into that conversation. But Henri Veesaar has often looked like one of the best players, one of the best centers in the country, in my opinion. He's playing at a level that Carolina has simply not had out of their big since Armando Bacot. And Henri Veesaar brings a lot different skill set to the floor than what Bacot brought. But it's really fun to watch. I love watching Veesaar as a player. I think he's, very talented. Are there spots where he could clean up some minor things? Like, I noticed he was getting bodied a lot and at times in the Navy game, but he still played solid defense. Yeah, but he has been arguably the second best player on this team for the entirety of the season thus far. So I think that's where you have to go for most impactful transfer.
Yeah, I don't even think it's an argument for him being the second best player for Carolina through the first handful of games. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's averaging 14.8 points, 7.8 rebounds, nearly 2 assists and 2 blocks per contest, and he's doing so while shooting, a very efficient 64% from the field, 44% from 3, and nearly 70% from inside the 3-point line. He has validated every reason why he was target number 1 for Carolina's coaching staff and their front office when he entered the portal. He's proven right for Carolina to practically over-recruit Van Allen Lubin and force Van Allen Lubin to get his feelings hurt and go play for Will Wade and NC State. And he's just been I refer to him as a steady force for Carolina. He's just, whenever Carolina needs him, he's there. Whether it's to hit a transition 3 to open up the offense, whether it's to set a big screen to get a guard free on a drive, to get an offensive rebound, to do what he does defensively. And I think you're right. For a big man, it looks a lot different than what you're used to seeing from a Tyler Hansborough, a Tyler Zeller, a Bryce Johnson, Kennedy Meeks, Armando Bacot. But he's having that same type of impact. And when Carolina's got a good big, a really good big, history shows they're going to be really tough to handle. And he's off to a sensational start. He's added a leadership quality as well. He's very vocal. He's very animated. He's very emotional. And I know that's, for me, something as a fan that resonates. And it's really just been a nice welcome addition. I think he's been a really big part of this revamped culture as well that Hubert Davis is trying to install within the walls of his program. A lot of conversation around Kyan Evans. He's off to a little bit of a rocky start. It's nowhere near where I thought he would be coming out, but for that though, he's averaging 8 points per game. He's averaging over 5 assists per game. He's not shooting the ball well, just 41% from the field and 32% from the three-point line. We know how important the point guard position is to Carolina. I always say there's not a program in the country that puts more on their point guard than the UNC program. When he's played well, Carolina looks like a Final Four team, i.e. that second half against Kansas where he scored all 12 of his points. When he struggled, you could see a group that could be very limited offensively in the half court. What do you make to the first 5 games of the Colorado State transfer and Kyan Evans?
It's kind of interesting because I look at Kyan Evans and I say, how has he impacted the game? And he doesn't turn the ball over that much, and he facilitates really well. And I listen to a bunch of people say, "Oh, we need him to score more." If Luka Bogovac and Caleb Wilson and Henri Veesaar are all scoring at the rate that they're at, I'm okay with him giving you 8 points a game. I'm not one that thinks he should be scoring, more than 12 points a game. Would that be nice? Yeah. But I feel like what he is giving you through these first 5 games is a facilitator point guard that, first of all, doesn't turn the ball over at the rate that Elliot Cadeau did. Second of all, isn't nearly as unpredictable as Elliot Cadeau is. And when you look at the shooting efficiency, he had a bad shooting night the other night, and that really tanked his percentage. He was shooting 41% from 3 before the Navy game, and then he went 1 for 8 from 3, and that tanked his percentage. So I'm not too worried about that one. I don't really pay attention to shooting percentages until about the start of ACC play, unless you're a guy like Veesaar or Wilson that's shooting over 60%. That's definitely something you can look at and say that's really good. But I'm not worried about the percentages. I really like what he's done. The 5 assists especially, that's what we want out of our point guard is, move the ball and then score it if you have to. And I do think the scoring will come eventually when he gets a little bit more comfortable. Obviously, if he knocks down a couple more of those shots against Navy, we aren't talking about, how bad his percentages is. We're probably talking about, he may not be scoring at the rate that we want, but at least he's shooting okay. So I like what Kyan Evans has done. I do think it's definitely sustainable. We know what kind of talent he has. And I really like what he brings to this team. And I do think he was the right pickup out of the transfer portal for Hubert Davis.
Well, I think it's important to quantify 2 things here. I said all summer long that if Elliot Cadeau had this roster built around him, you'd see a better version of him. They're asking him to not do too much right now. They're asking him to run the team. And I think for the most part, he's doing a really good job of that. I did think the other night, it was an incredible coaching job by Navy, and it was really fun to watch it in person. I thought he was the offensive player that struggled the most with the different defensive looks that he had to deal with on a possession-by-possession basis. You'd see a full court press that fell into a 2-3 zone, a 2-3 zone that would switch to man mid-possession. You saw a 2-2-1 at one point, something you don't really see in the game of basketball at any level, let alone the college level. And so I thought he was really thrown off by all that. But these are why you love playing those games and why you love seeing that, because now he'll be better prepared for it if he sees it again. And Carolina has seen a bunch of different defenses here early on. They've seen a lot of zone, and they're learning how to attack it. And when you've got guys that pass the ball as well as, Wilson and Veesaar do, that high-low game becomes really impactful, and it's how Carolina can best attack it. But, look, he's got to shoot it better, more consistently. There's no doubt about that. I think what you got to like about this kid is there's a mental toughness to where when he's played bad, he doesn't pout. He doesn't whine. That was my biggest problem with Elliot Cadeau. When Elliot Cadeau was bad, and he was bad, and it permeated throughout the rest of his game, and it really just went up and down the roster because when you're the point guard, you're the leader of the team, you're the extension of the coach. And he wasn't mature enough to handle playing that position at Carolina. I love the maturity that I've seen from Kyan Evans. And I came out of the North Carolina Central game saying, God, I want him to shoot the ball more. Well, he can't shoot the ball more and miss a bunch of shots, and then I complain about it. Then I'd be a coward. And there's, that's not what I am. So I loved the aggressiveness I saw the other night, because I think the more that he shoots, the more often the ball is going to go into the basket. And Carolina fans just need to be patient. There is still a learning curve, even though he's a junior, for playing basketball, for playing point guard at the University of North Carolina. You brought up Jaren Stevenson, and I think, he's been maybe the unsung hero of the first 5 games or so for Carolina. And I think, if you're a smart basketball person, you can just see how he's impacting winning. Talking about a guy that's only averaging, 7.8 points per game, but is averaging 5 rebounds per contest, and is shooting, just 29% from 3, 40% from the field. But if you watch the way this guy defends, I mean, this is Leaky Black on crack, because he's bigger, he's longer, he's more physical. And when I say he can guard the 2 through the 5, I'm not exaggerating. In my mind, though, I think when Trimble comes back and this roster is full, I think he moves to the bench and becomes Carolina's backup 5. I don't think I can trust Zayden High, James Brown to play those types of minutes over the course of 18 conference games. What have you seen so far from Jaren Stevenson? And do you believe, like me, that when Trimble comes back, Stevenson is the one that gets regulated to the bench, not Luka Bogovac, but provides some, front court depth for Carolina behind Henri Veesaar?
Well, if it wasn't for Caleb Wilson doing all that he's doing, Jared Stevenson would be my favorite player on this roster, because I absolutely love to watch this guy play. He's long, and I would argue he can guard the 1 through 5, not just the 2 through 5. I legitimately believe that if Carolina had to put him on a point guard, he would guard his yard. We saw that. I mean, we saw that in the Sweet 16 the other year when he was switched on to RJ Davis. RJ could not get around him. But I do disagree with you there. I would rather have Luka scoring off the bench and have Jaren Stevenson as a tone setter in the starting lineup. I really like what his length brings you in the starting lineup. I really like our starting lineup right now, even without Seth Trimble, just because of how long it is. I mean, our smallest player is, Kai and Evans, but they're, compared to last year when Carolina would often have 3 guys that were, 6'3" and under. Now we don't have a single, or we only have 1 player that's like that. I really like what Stevenson can bring to a starting lineup. And I also kind of think, we've seen a little bit in the past couple of games, Stevenson has the potential to be a double-digit points average, point scorer. I really like, he hasn't really shot the ball very well yet, but he came from a program in Alabama that wanted him to literally just stand in the corner and be a big man shooter, which we haven't seen that a lot from Carolina, but I do feel like Carolina will eventually allow him to step out and shoot more once we kind of figure out once we kind of figure out what we need out of him moving forward. And Hubert Davis is obviously going to be working on that. And I really like what Stevenson brings on both ends of the floor. So it's really hard, because as much as I like Luka, I just don't feel like he gives you as much as Stevenson does on the defensive end, which is kind of why I would rather bring Luka off the bench for his scoring. So yeah, I like what Stevenson has done. And we'll see what Hubert Davis has and how he continues to utilize him moving forward.
Yeah, look, I love Carolina's starting lineup. When you got 4 guys 6'6" or bigger, you're going to be pretty tough to beat, just because of how just freaking big and long they are. And more importantly, they're bought in on that end of the floor. This team is bought in to defending at a high level at a rate that we're not used to seeing Carolina teams play at. Post-Roy Williams era to present day. This feels very Dean Smith-esque, where those teams were good offensively. They were efficient, but they were as good as they were because of the way that they defended. But the lack of production from Zayden High and James Brown is the biggest concern right now on this roster, because Zayden High, when he touches the basketball, you don't know what he's going to do. He looks like a hyena, and he's never under control, and he's always moving at a pace that's quicker than what the game is being played at. James Brown, I think, is a solid guy, and I think could be a big part of what Carolina does next year. I still think he's a year away from being someone that you can put in a big spot on the road in the second half when Henri Veesaar is sitting there with 3 fouls and not kill you, which is why I just think it makes sense to move Stevenson to the bench, become the backup 5 for Henry, while he's still going to play starter-like minutes, because that lineup that we see that Carolina's playing with now will be a lineup that plays extensive minutes moving forward, even when Trimble comes back. Like, I think it's important to get that point across, is that just because Trimble gets back doesn't mean that Carolina's not going to play big. They were always going to play big, because Hubert Davis told you when he recruited all these guys, I want to play bigger. We need to play bigger because of the way other teams around the conference, other teams around the country, they have constructed their roster. But what he's done individually speaks volumes about who he is as a player, because this was a former 5-star recruit that, left the backyard to go to Alabama, was, I always thought, misused, which is why he transferred. And I always said during the summer, if he bought into a role that Hubert Davis could identify, he's going to be a real big part of what Carolina does. And credit to Hubert for identifying that role. Credit to him for buying into that role. And he's been the unsung hero for Carolina over the course of the first 5 games. The guy that hasn't been the unsung hero, he's been everything and so much more, has been Caleb Wilson. It says it takes a lot for me to say that I drool watching a freshman play basketball. I watch this guy and I'm like a dog in heat. I'm salivating and I'm foaming at the mouth because he's just so dang gifted. He's so dang skilled, and he plays so hard that's the best part of his game, is his effort and his energy, outside more of his talent. What do you say so far about a guy that in his first 5 games at Carolina, all he's doing is averaging a double-double, 20.6 points per game, 10 rebounds per game, and is doing so while shooting 67% from the field and 40% from behind the three-point line? What does Caleb Wilson impressed you the most about his start of his collegiate basketball career?
Well, let me just say that coming out of high school, I had no clue who this guy was, even though he was a top 5 recruit. And maybe that speaks to I need to know ball better. But when he came in and I saw him over the summer, I was like, who the heck is this guy? This guy is incredible. And I watched him scrimmage a couple of the older guys, and he scrimmaged with the older guys against the team, and he straight up dunked on Henri Veesaar. And that's when I knew we've got a guy. I wasn't expecting it. Frankly, I was not expecting 20 points a game through the first 5 games of the season. I thought there would be a growth period with him, which is why I was so high on Seth Trimble and thought that he would be having those big scoring numbers, because frankly, I did not expect this out of Wilson. He's everything Carolina wanted and more. And the crazy thing is he's only going to improve. We haven't even seen him use his jumper. He's only taken 1 3 in every game this season. Which blows my mind, because you would think that people would start sagging off of him and not letting him get to the rim. He gets to the rim anyway. It doesn't matter what you do, because he's going to post up. He's going to use that spin move that he does, and then he's going to dunk on you. And the effort that this guy plays with, I watched him against Navy, and I'm pretty sure you guys brought this up in the Navy recap podcast. There was 3 straight possessions where he was all over these guys on the defensive end, and it resulted in him getting 3 straight steals and eventually 3 straight dunks. I mean, and I also think you have to look at this guy's attitude as well, man, because it's incredible. You hear him in his press conferences talking about, yeah, I didn't play that great in the first half, and then I came out and was just like, he just casually says he's just going to take over the game, and that's what he does. I mean, when this guy plays angry, I don't think there's a person in the country that can stop him. And I still think he's being underrated by a lot of these NBA draft people. I think he's better than guys like Darren Peterson, in my opinion, just because of how high the upside is. And you talk about salivating at the mouth. I'm not going to go to that extreme, but I am really excited to watch him play basketball the rest of this season. And we can cross our fingers all we want. He's probably going to the NBA this year, but wouldn't it be awesome if we could get this guy for another year or 2 more years? I mean, imagine if this was football and we had this guy for 3. That'd just be, that'd just be incredible, because that's just how good this guy is.
Yeah, he's going to do the Kobe White thing where he's going to pretty much be an all-time Carolina guy while only playing 1 year at the university. Because first off, he's the perfect model and example for what Hubert Davis wants in a top 10 recruit. Like, first off, he's got the basketball thing, which is the most important thing down. He's gifted. He's talented. He works hard. The kid loves being at Carolina. The kid loves being a Tar Heel. Hubert always says, when you come here, we're not a pit stop. You're going to have 2 feet in, and you're going to be a part of this university, part of this community. And then all he's done in his first handful of games is organize a whiteout, organize a blue out. When you go back to the TCU football game, when Carolina had the pregame concert, he was there at the pit just hanging out. You don't have to do that stuff because he's the big man on campus. But he loves being at Carolina, and he loves the spotlight. And he continues to be underrated, and that's more fuel for his fire because he says going into every game he gets himself pissed off, and then he goes out there and he plays his butt off. And the more people continue to doubt him, the more he'll continue to piss himself off and to continue to play at the level that he's playing at. And I don't want to exaggerate, but I truly believe this. I've seen all the freshmen so far play college basketball. He's good enough to lead Carolina to the Final Four. He's good enough to be the best player on a team that wins championships. And you don't typically see that stuff from freshmen at Carolina unless you're Jordan, unless you're Hansbrough. Kobe White as a freshman was that good. And I think it's fair to say that he's in that category. When his career comes to an end, and it'll be, in March, hopefully in April, he'll be one of the best all-time one-and-done Tar Heels the program has ever produced. Let's get to the big talking point coming out of the Navy game, which was the players-only meeting. And that was the topic of conversation that everyone and their mother and maybe their brother has an opinion on, whether they know the story or not. We talked about it when we recapped the game. It took us 27 minutes for the players to get released to us in the media. And our good buddies, Andrew Jones, Michael Coe, they were talking about how this was a long wait, not as long as the Wake Forest game a few years ago, where it took 48 minutes for Carolina to release their players, but they were in the locker room for quite some time. And we thought it was because Hubert Davis was getting in them, and I think he did. But after Hubert Davis got done talking to him, here comes senior injured guard Seth Trimble, who calls a team meeting and says, hey, the way that we finished this game is not good enough. The way that we played during this game is not good enough. The way we approached this game was not good enough. And that's leadership to a degree that you rarely see at the college level, but something that you haven't seen so far at Carolina at different times under Hubert Davis. What did you make of the report when you saw the team meeting, and what does it say about the leadership that exists on this year's roster?
It's the reason why I think this is the best team Hubert Davis has ever had, because even when we had guys like Cormac Ryan and Harrison Ingram, they didn't have to go through the little bit. I mean, yeah, they had some adversity, but I think in the end that this is going to be the best team that Hubert Davis has ever had, just because of the level of accountability. We were leading Notre Dame by 24 points with 4 minutes to go. And you look at that and you say, oh, well, Carolina just got a little bit sloppy at the end, and they still won by 12. They're fine. But it wasn't good enough for these players. And that's really what I love about this team and their leadership. And they're always striving for perfection. Seth Trimble is still the leader of this team, even though he's on the sidelines. There was a part I think it may have been coming out of the second half or coming out of the halftime locker room right before the second half start. Maybe it was out of a timeout, but Seth Trimble was huddled with the 5 starters, and he was talking to them. That's leadership, guys. And I love Seth Trimble. I think he's gonna go down. Maybe not go down as he's gonna go down as one of the best role players Carolina has ever had throughout his 4 years. And I really think that with the leadership that he brings to this program, you may think I'm crazy for saying he's one of the best role players. He may turn into one of the better leaders that Carolina has had when we're done with this season. And I can't wait for him to get back on the floor, because then we get to see that leadership in action. But I love the fact that these players are taking accountability for where they feel like they're not playing well enough. And, you know, it doesn't concern me in the least. You know, I've heard of some people saying, oh, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they feel like they didn't play well enough and they need to step up and own up to it. And I think it takes men to admit that. And you know, last year and maybe even the year we missed the tournament, we had some boys on the team, but this year we've got men.
Well, I think, you know, what he's doing is he's validating why he stayed and why he didn't go somewhere else. He's waited 4 years for this moment. Where is he the guy? No, the guy is Caleb Wilson, but he is this team's vocal leader. And I do think in a lot of ways he might be the heart and soul and the backbone of this team, because he's been here the longest. He's the first ever Hubert Davis recruit that stayed 4 years. And he admitted earlier this summer that because of guys like RJ, Mondo, HI, and Cormac, he never felt like he could be the vocal leader that he's always felt like he is. And you've seen that on display here. And you saw it at times last year when Carolina got embarrassed at Clemson. Who was the guy calling his teammates out? It was Seth Trimble. When Carolina's season came to an end, when RJ's career came to an end, who was at the podium most visibly frustrated? It was Seth Trimble. And I absolutely hate it for him that he's injured and that this senior season has been cut short from in terms of playing and the games that he's going to get to play and all that. But you can tell that when he gets back, he's going to come back in a big way. He's itching to get back. And I think he's the best example of what college basketball is and what it stands for. You do your time, you improve year over year. He's going to become a better player all 4 years. And now he has a chance to be a part of something special. I think he's motivated for his head coach. I think he wants to shut a lot of people up that have, complained about the lack of success we've experienced under Hubert in his first 4 years. And can't wait to get him back, man, because you can tell this team misses him on the court, but he's still impacting the team off the court. All right, last thing we'll get to, and then we'll get out of here for this edition of Ashton's Analysis. So we're in the middle of what I'll call a bye week, if you will, because Carolina has a week off, something Hubert was really excited about, to get his guys in the gym and work on us. And the next time we see Carolina, they'll be in Fort Myers competing in that event, where they'll see St. Bonaventure on Tuesday night, and then they'll see Michigan State on Turkey Day at 4:30, where they'll be their first real test since the Kansas game. The Bonnies are a good program, a proud program out of the A-10, but still a game that Carolina should win. And then from there, you go see Kentucky in the ACC-SEC Challenge. Georgetown comes to Chapel Hill very soon, and you got a matchup with Ohio State in Atlanta later in December before you get into conference play. Has the 5-0 start to the season changed your expectations for this team moving forward?
Well, I think I remember saying that I expected this team to at least make the round of 32, and I could be forgetting what exactly I said, but I believe that the expectations have now been raised for this team. I think beating Kansas showed you that you're good enough to do some really good things. You have the potential. And guys, Kansas ran with Duke. Kansas was without Darren Peterson. So Kansas is not a bad team. They won't be ranked next week, unfortunately, but they are not a bad team by any stretch of the imagination. So beating Kansas is looking better and better, especially after that Duke game, where Kansas was leading for a good portion of that ball game before Duke eventually managed to pull away and win. You look at the schedule, and you've got St. Bonaventure. That should be a win for Carolina, but they cannot be underestimating St. Bonaventure. Michigan State's looked really, really good through the first couple games of the season. That's going to be a really, really tough test. I think Michigan State is going to end up being the measuring stick, because if we beat Michigan State, that's where you can say, okay, this team is now definitely good enough to reach the Final Four. And right now you say they have the potential to reach the Final Four. But in my opinion, if we beat Michigan State, it becomes this team is good enough to reach the Final Four. There is no potential about it. Kentucky at Rupp is always going to be tough, even though, especially since Kentucky's likely going to have a fire under their butt since they haven't been playing very well to start the season. And then I think that Georgetown game, that's going to be a big one at home. Weird Sunday start. Gonna be interesting to see how we fill out the Smith Center for that one. But I think by the time that game comes around, Georgetown's going to be a ranked opponent, and it's going to be definitely a tougher test than what Carolina anticipated at the beginning of the year. So I think the expectations have shifted a little bit for this Carolina team. I do think they are good enough to win an ACC title, especially after seeing Duke do what they – I mean, yes, Duke's good, but I do think Carolina can definitely 100% beat them. I think Carolina can definitely 100% beat Louisville. This team is good enough, in my opinion, to win an ACC title, and they have the potential to reach the Final Four. And then if they beat Michigan State, we'll start saying this team is good enough to reach the Final Four.
Yeah, I think what they've done is they've elevated their ceiling. Their floor, I think, was always top 4 ACC, win a game, maybe 2 games in the NCAA tournament, go from there. I think they've now raised the ceiling where I still think Louisville's the best team in this conference. But could they win an ACC title with the way that their front court's playing and producing? Absolutely. Because I don't know if Louisville has a guy as great as that backcourt is, if they have a guy that can handle Caleb Wilson. And, I always thought, could they make the second week of the tournament? Absolutely. And what do they say about the second week of the tournament? From there on, it's a crapshoot. Well, if that's the case, if I think they've elevated their ceiling, I think they're in the list of schools. When you're rattling off Final Four contenders, I think you have to say North Carolina. And I don't think that was a given when the season started. But I think you've seen the way they've played. We've seen some of the ways some of these other teams have played. And I think when you have that conversation in early November, which is ridiculous to have, but if you're having that conversation, I don't think you can talk about Final Four contenders and not say Carolina, which is where Carolina should be. I always say that the requirement is that you field a team that could make the Final Four every year. And in the old days, when you actually had to recruit and build rosters, that was somewhat hard to demand on a year in, year out basis, but it should not be out of question in the portal era where you rebuild and reload every single year. And I think Hubert Davis has rebuilt and put together a roster that can make a Final Four. And if he does that, guess what? We're not talking about his job security. We're talking about him having one of the best starts to a coaching career in the history of the sport, because there'll be 2 Final Fours in 5 years. And hopefully if we get to it this year, there's a different result attached to it. So that's what and I think that's what you were expecting Carolina to do, was to really elevate their ceiling in the first handful of games. And they've done that. They've achieved that. And now we'll learn a lot more about them next week when they're in Fort Myers, Florida, when they take on St. Bonaventure. But then again, as you mentioned, that Michigan State game on Thanksgiving Day, that'll be a one where we really see where this program is at. And if Carolina wins it, I think the hype machine goes up to an even higher level than it did after the win over Kansas, after the way with where Kansas is dealing right now with the injury to Darren Peterson. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the podcast. In the meantime, guys, we will direct you guys to our website, HeelToughBlog.com, where we've had you covered through all first 5 games of the season. Games have been previewed. Games have been recapped. and any news and notes that's emerged, we've had you covered with that. We'll be doing the same with you next week, even though it's a holiday week with the 2 games that Carolina has. You know, Anthony has you covered all things UNC football. Big 2 final games of the year. Carolina has to win both to go to a bowl game, both against rivals. First up is Duke in the battle for the victory bell. He'll have you covered the game preview, the game recap, and so much more. So with that, we just want you to get to the website, guys, HeelToughBlog.com, the latest and best coverage, Carolina basketball, Tar Heel football. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Just search the Four Corners Podcast and we'll pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show. If you're a video consumer of the podcast, best way to find us, like and follow us on Facebook at Heel Tough Blog. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Heel Tough Blog. Or follow me on Twitter at HTB_Josh. If you do any of those 3 things, the second that we go live, you'll be notified, and you can be a part of our conversation around the Tar Heels. But with that, folks, this is going to wrap up this edition of the show. Dueling Ashtin once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.